I was working the night shift when the first signal came in. That sounds dramatic, I know. Everything sounds dramatic in hindsight. But I want to be clear, at the time it wasn't dramatic at all. It was a Thursday. I had a half-eaten sandwich on my desk, a cold cup of coffee that I kept forgetting to throw away, and a stack of calibration reports I was supposed to file before midnight. The terminal on my left was running its usual noise filter sequence. The one on my right was pulling spectral data from 3 of our deep field relay buoys. Standard stuff, the kind of night where nothing happens and you're grateful for it. My name is Dr. Yusuf Ademi. I was a signal analyst at the Arecibo Successor Array, what the media still calls Nasal 7, which I hate because it sounds like a nasal spray. The official name is the Northern Atlantic Signal Acquisition Laboratory, 7th Array. We were based off the coast of Iceland, on a converted research platform the size of a small city. It wasn't glamorous. The cafeteria smelled like fish 3 days out of 7, the heating never quite worked below deck level 4, and my quarters were roughly the size of a university dorm room. But the equipment, the equipment was extraordinary. We could hear a whisper from 400 light-years away if the conditions were right. The signal came in at 2:47 a.m. local time. It wasn't clean, nothing real ever is. It came in messy, fragmented, layered across 17 different frequencies simultaneously, and pulsing at a rhythm that didn't match any natural phenomenon in our database. I almost flagged it as atmospheric interference and went back to my sandwich. I almost did, but something made me run the secondary filter first. Old habit. Something my supervisor Prita always drilled into us. Run the filter before you dismiss. The filter cleared the noise. What was underneath stopped me cold. It was structured, not just structured, it was intentionally structured. I'm not talking about the kind of thing where you stare at random noise long enough and your brain starts seeing patterns. I'm talking about mathematical sequencing, prime number intervals, Fibonacci progression embedded in the carrier wave. And underneath all of that, something that made my skin actually prickle, a repeating geometric compression that our decryption software later identified as a coordinate map. Coordinates pointing directly at Earth. I sat there for about 4 seconds, which felt like 4 hours, and then I picked up the phone and called Prita. She answered on the second ring, which told me she wasn't actually sleeping. Prita Singh never really slept. She existed in a kind of perpetual half-conscious state where she was always available and always slightly irritated about it. "What?" she said, not a question, a statement. "I need you to come look at something." "Is it the buoy array?" I told Marcus the calibration on. "It's not the buoy array." Silence on her end, then how bad? "I don't know yet, that's why I need you to come look." She was there in 6 minutes. She walked in wearing a thermal jacket over her pajamas, her hair tied back, reading glasses already on even though she'd need different glasses to look at the terminal. She always did that. She grabbed her reading glasses when something felt serious, even when they were wrong for the task. I think it was a comfort thing. She looked at my screen for about 90 seconds without saying anything. Then she said, "Run it again." I ran it again. She watched the whole sequence play out. The prime intervals, the Fibonacci wave, the coordinate compression. Then she took off her reading glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on the desk beside my sandwich. "Call Director Nkemelu," she said. "Don't use the internal line, use the secure channel." "Prita." "Now Yusuf." Director Nkemelu arrived with 4 people I'd never seen before. 2 of them were in military uniform, not our usual naval liaison people, but something different. A branch I didn't recognize. The other 2 were in civilian clothes that were too neat for the hour, which told me they'd either not gone to bed or they'd been dressed and waiting for a call exactly like this one. That part bothered me more than anything else that night. The signal was verified 3 times by 3 separate teams, using 3 different analytical frameworks. The consensus was unanimous and terrifying in its simplicity. The signal was extraterrestrial in origin, it was deliberate, and it had been transmitting for approximately 6 hours before we caught it, which meant it had been playing on loop, broadcasting to Earth repeatedly, and we'd only just noticed. The director pulled me aside around 4 in the morning. "How many people know?" he asked. "My team, 6 people, Prita, the verification teams." "Nobody else?" "Not from my end." He nodded. He had the look of a man who was adding numbers in his head and not liking the sum. Good. Keep it that way for now. Director, what does the coordinate map actually indicate? Is it their position? A trajectory? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about almost every day since. Both, he said, and the trajectory is inbound. Chapter 2, What They Looked Like Coming In. I need to explain something about scale. When people talk about alien fleets in movies, they show these massive ships hovering over cities, blocking out the sun, close enough that you can see the details on the hull. That's not how it happened. The first fleet, the Vreth Dominion fleet, though we didn't know what to call them then, they arrived in what we now call the outer approach, the edge of our solar system, somewhere near the heliopause, which is roughly 120 times the distance from the Earth to the sun. That's so far away that light from that distance takes about 17 hours to reach us. We saw them before they could possibly see us react. We had that much. The long-range sensors picked up the fleet 7 weeks after the signal. Dr. Chen Wei, our deep space optical analyst in the Beijing Cooperative Array, was the first to get a clean resolution image. She sent it to us without comment, which wasn't like her. Dr. Chen always had comments. She sent volumes of annotation with everything she transmitted. She sent this one image with nothing attached except her personal verification signature and the words, confirmed, optical. Not instrument error. I printed that image. I still have it somewhere in a folder I don't open often. The fleet was vast. That word vast doesn't really do it justice, but English doesn't have a better one for this context. There were approximately 400 distinct vessels visible in the initial image, ranging in size from what appeared to be escort-class ships, perhaps a kilometer in length, up to what the analysis teams eventually called the carrier thrones, which were structures so enormous that trying to fit a number to them felt absurd. The largest one measured, at our best estimate, approximately 62 kilometers from bow to stern. 62 kilometers. For reference, the island of Manhattan is about 21 kilometers long. So picture 3 Manhattans, end to end, moving through space. Now make it angular and deliberate and armored and covered in what appeared to be energy-projecting arrays. Now multiply that by 11, because that was the count of carrier throne class vessels in the initial fleet. And then remember they were moving. Not fast by interstellar standards, they were decelerating, actually, coming in careful and measured, like they knew exactly where they were going and saw no reason to rush, like they'd done this before. Like 400 warships descending on a planet was just a logistical exercise to them, something you do with the same routine efficiency that a postal service delivers packages. That was the part that got me, not the size, the calmness of it. Back on Earth, the governments knew. Not all of them at first. Information like that doesn't flow evenly. The major powers had it within 48 hours of Chen's confirmation. The smaller nations got varying degrees of briefing depending on their security relationships. The general public had no idea. The media had no idea. Life continued in its ordinary rhythmic chaos, traffic jams and sports scores and celebrity divorces and harvest festivals and school runs and everything else that makes up the texture of being human, while 400 alien warships methodically crossed the outer rim of our solar system. I thought about that a lot during those weeks, about all the people going about their days. A man in a market in Tunis arguing with a vendor about the price of figs. A woman in Osaka waiting on a train platform, earphones in, watching rain streak down the window. Kids in a school in Nairobi doing a geography quiz. All of them completely unaware. There's something that I still can't decide is beautiful or devastating about that. The emergency councils convened. I know this partly from direct experience. I was pulled into several technical briefings, and partly from the after-action records that were eventually declassified. There were fierce, grinding arguments about what to do, whether to attempt communication, whether to disclose to the public, whether to begin evacuation of coastal cities, of population centers, of anything. Though the absurdity of trying to evacuate 8 billion people was not lost on anyone in those rooms. The military factions across every major power wanted to arm up immediately. The scientific community wanted to attempt dialogue. The diplomatic corps wanted to do both simultaneously and also establish a unified human response coalition, which sounds simple until you realize that getting every nation to agree on anything simultaneously has never once happened in all of recorded human history. What actually emerged from those weeks of frantic argument was something that surprised me when I heard about it. Something I'm not sure I entirely understood at the time, but that I've come to think was, in retrospect, possibly the most important decision humanity has ever made. We deployed the grid. Chapter 3, The Grid. Most people don't know this name. The grid wasn't public knowledge until years later. Even now, the full scope of what it is remains classified at levels I don't have access to, and I was inside the program. So what I can tell you is what I observed, and what I was briefed on, and what I pieced together later. The grid is what happens when every militarized space program on Earth quietly, steadily, over the course of decades, builds something together and tells almost nobody. I know that sounds impossible. Nations cooperating on something massive and keeping it secret, with the internet, with leakers and journalists and whistleblowers. I thought the same thing, and then I started understanding the shape of it and I realized, no, actually, this is exactly the kind of thing that can stay secret because it was never one big program. It was hundreds of small programs. Defense contracts that looked routine. Satellite launches that were real satellites doing real work, plus one extra component. Research grants to universities that produced real research and also real data going to real quiet offices. Infrastructure upgrades to existing systems. Software updates to existing networks. Nothing that looked like a weapons program. Nothing that looked like coordination. Just thousands of tiny pieces, each one innocent in isolation, each one fitting perfectly into a pattern that only a handful of people on Earth ever got to see the full shape of. Colonel Fatima al-Rashidi of the UAE Space Defense Division, I met her during one of the technical briefings, explained it to me in terms I could understand. She said, "Yusuf, imagine you are building a wall. But you cannot let anyone see you building a wall. So you tell this person to place one brick, and you tell that person to place one brick, and eventually you have a wall and nobody saw it being built because each person only placed one brick. That's a lot of coordination to pull off without anyone noticing," I said. She smiled. It was not a light smile. We had 53 years. 53 years? The grid had been in active development since before I was born. I'll try to describe what the grid actually is without using the technical language that would lose most people, because the technical language almost lost me, and I have 2 degrees in astrophysics. Think of the inner solar system, Mercury to Mars, plus the asteroid belt, as a volume of space. The grid is essentially a distributed weapons and sensor network seeded throughout that entire volume. It operates in layers. The outermost layer is pure detection, passive sensors, listening stations, pressure wave relays, everything capable of feeding real-time data back to processing centers on Earth and on the Moon. The next layer inward is kinetic, essentially sophisticated automated railgun platforms distributed at varying orbital distances, each one independent and self-powered, each one capable of independent targeting. The third layer is electromagnetic in nature. The fourth layer I was only briefed on in broad strokes, and what I was told suggested physics that I had previously thought were still theoretical. The whole system is networked. Every component talks to every other component through quantum entanglement relay nodes. The civilian QE communication tech that got announced publicly about 10 years ago was, I learned, the declassified fraction of systems that had existed in military form for considerably longer. The targeting calculation happens in distributed fashion across thousands of nodes simultaneously. So there's no single point of failure, no central brain you can knock out to disable the whole thing. The Vreth Dominion fleet was flying directly into it. And they had no idea. Because from the outside, from deep space, Earth looked like it always had. A small, blue, unremarkable planet with some rudimentary satellite infrastructure and radio signals, and absolutely no indication that anything had been waiting for them. Colonel al-Rashidi told me something else during that briefing. She said the grid had been tested, extensively, not against alien threats, obviously, but against simulated threat profiles of every category they'd modeled. The results had been consistently above expectation. "We are not helpless," she told me. "We have not been helpless for a long time. The universe does not need to know that yet." I asked her what above expectation meant specifically. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. something between grim satisfaction and something more complicated. "It means," she said, "that if something comes at Earth with the intent to destroy it, Earth will not be destroyed." "And the fleet coming in," I said. "We're watching it," she said. "We watch everything." Chapter 4, First Contact. The fleet reached Mars orbit with 6 weeks still on the clock. That's not how they planned it. We figured out later that their deceleration profile was miscalculated. They expected Earth to be further in its orbital position and adjusted their approach accordingly, which brought them into Martian space ahead of schedule. They paused there for 11 days, which told us something interesting. They were capable of patience when they chose it. They weren't in a hurry. They were making observations, gathering data. 11 days of nothing. Then a signal came. This one was different from the first. The first signal had been navigational. "Come here, here is where we're going." This one was communicative. It was long and dense and took our teams 3 days to develop even a partial framework for interpreting it. What they extracted, and I want to be very clear that extracted here means constructed the most plausible interpretation of fragmentary data, rather than anything resembling a certain translation, was this. "You are assessed, you are found insufficient, transfer of sovereignty, acknowledgement requested." That's the clean version. The internal debate about the exact phrasing went on for weeks, and I don't think complete consensus was ever actually reached. But the broad thrust of those 4 phrases was universally agreed upon. The Vreth Dominion had observed Earth. They had made some kind of judgment, and they were telling us, not asking, to hand over authority. Acknowledgement requested, not agreement requested, not response requested. Acknowledgement, as in, you will acknowledge this is happening. Dr. Leonard Osai, our lead xenolinguist, sat in front of his terminal for a long time after the translation session. He's a quiet man, Leonard, methodical and careful with his words. He looked at that translation for a long time and then he said, "They've done this before. This message is procedural. It's a form. They're filling in a form." "What do you mean?" someone asked. "I mean this is their standard acquisition document. This isn't the opening of a conversation. This is paperwork. They send this to every world they intend to absorb." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Leonard said quietly, "They don't expect a real answer. They expect silence or surrender. They don't think of what comes next as a fight. They think of it as processing." Earth's response took 72 hours. Not because we couldn't decide what to say. We knew within about 4 hours. The argument for those remaining 68 hours was about tone. Whether to be defiant, whether to be measured, whether to say anything at all, whether the response mattered. In the end, the response that went out was composed by a committee of 17 people from 11 countries, refined over 3 days, translated by Leonard's team, and broadcast on the same frequency structure the Dominion had used. I've read the official record of the response. In our words, in its most direct translation, it was approximately this. "Your assessment is noted. Sovereignty transfer is declined. Earth is not available for acquisition. You are advised to adjust course." Clean, final, no anger in it. No fear either, which I think was the harder thing to achieve. Somewhere in Mars orbit, the Vreth Dominion fleet received that message. And then, after a pause of about 9 hours, they began moving again. Toward Earth. Chapter 5, The Waiting. I want to talk about the waiting. Because nobody ever talks about the waiting in these stories. They skip from the decision to the action because the waiting doesn't make for compelling narrative. But the waiting is where most of it lives. The waiting is where the human experience of that week actually existed. We knew the fleet was coming. We knew when they'd arrive in near-Earth space, roughly 78 hours from the moment they broke orbit from Mars. We knew the grid was active and operational and that the weapons teams had targeting solutions already loaded and updated in real time. We knew, or at least the people with full grid clearance knew, that we had a real chance. Better than a real chance, according to the projections. But knowledge doesn't fill 78 hours. The platform I worked on, the research array off Iceland, was not in any strategic targeting zone. We weren't a military asset that a first strike would prioritize. But that didn't make the hours easy. We were still people, and we knew that something unprecedented and potentially catastrophic was coming, and we were in a building that floated on the North Atlantic with nowhere to meaningfully go. We had a common room on level 3 with a big viewport that looked out over the water. A lot of us spent time there, not really talking, just present with each other. The ocean was doing what oceans do, heaving gently in long gray swells, the horizon doing its slow curve. Normal, perfectly normal. Preeta came and sat with me once during that stretch. She'd brought 2 cups of tea, proper tea, which was hard to find on the platform, and she handed one over without saying anything. We sat and watched the water for a while. "Do you think it works?" I asked her. "The grid. Any of it? Do you think we actually have something real, or did we just convince ourselves we're prepared so we wouldn't go mad with fear?" She considered this for a long time. That was one of the things I always respected about Preeta. She actually thought before she spoke. She didn't perform thinking, she did it. "I think," she said carefully, "that humanity is better at 2 things than anything else in the universe." "Which 2? "Surviving," she said, "and building things to help us survive." She took a sip of her tea. "Everything else we do, art, science, love, all of it, I think it's just what happens in the gaps between those 2 things. And I think we've been building for a very long time." I thought about the grid. 53 years of quiet, patient work, hundreds of components, thousands of people each placing 1 brick. "Yeah," I said, "I think so too." The public disclosure happened 30 hours before the fleet's projected arrival. I don't know if it was the right call. I've gone back and forth on that. On one hand, people deserved to know. On the other hand, there were riots. Not everywhere. In some cities there was remarkable calm. In others, there was panic that cost lives before the threat even arrived. In some places, people gathered in open spaces and sang. In others, they went to religious sites and prayed. In others still, they went home to their families and locked the door and held each other. I don't have a verdict on which response was correct. I think they all were in their own way. I think that's what being human means, that there's no single right way to face the impossible, and the variety of responses isn't a flaw. It's the point. The broadcast that went out was measured and factual. It confirmed the fleet. It confirmed the communication exchange. It confirmed that defenses were in place and active. It did not guarantee anything, because the people who authorized it understood that promising certainty you can't deliver is its own kind of harm. What it did say, and this part was added at the insistence of a small group of scientists and humanists who fought hard to include it, was this: "You are not alone in facing this. Every nation on Earth stands with every other. Whatever happens in the hours ahead, we face it as one." Corny, maybe, but I watched Preeta read it on her screen and she didn't say it was corny. She just nodded once and went back to her work. Chapter 6, HFY arrived. At 3:14 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, a time which has since become something of a marking point. The leading edge of the Vreth Dominion fleet crossed inside the lunar orbit. I was at my station, most of us were. Not because we had anything specific to do in those moments. The grid systems were autonomous. They didn't need our hands on them, but because none of us could sleep and there was nowhere else to be. The long-range sensors painted the picture in real time on every terminal, every screen, every display across the network. 412 vessels now, they'd closed up their formation for the final approach, which was a tactical decision that, we'd learn later from the post-event analysis, was a mistake. Closing formation makes a fleet look more powerful. It also makes the individual ships more vulnerable to cascading kinetic events. They looked enormous on screen. Even reduced to sensor data icons, even knowing the display was schematic rather than literal, the sheer number of them made the screen feel heavy, made the air in the room feel heavy. Nobody spoke. The fleet held at the lunar distance for approximately 11 minutes, possibly making final calculations, possibly sending one last internal communication, possibly doing whatever the equivalent of taking a breath is for a civilization that had absorbed, by our best estimate, somewhere between 40 and 60 worlds before this moment. Then they began the final descent. And the grid woke up. I want to be precise about what I witnessed and what I'm reconstructing from records. I was watching sensor data in real time. I was not watching the actual engagement. That happened in space, in darkness, at distances that make human observation meaningless without instrumentation. So what I can tell you is what the sensors showed, and what the analysis teams later reconstructed, and what the recordings from our orbital observation platforms captured. The grid's first action was the sensor net, purely observational, mapping every vessel in the fleet with targeting resolution precision in the first 4 seconds. 4 seconds to achieve full targeting lock on 412 vessels simultaneously. I don't think the Dominion even registered what was happening. They were looking at Earth. They were thinking about their next communication. They were not thinking about the space around them, because in their experience, the space around a target planet was empty. It was always empty. It had always been empty. 53 years of hidden work said otherwise. The first kinetic volleys launched from the outer layer stations at 3:27 a.m. I want to be honest about my emotional state in that moment. I had known intellectually that this was coming. I'd had 78 hours to prepare. I'd had weeks of briefings. I understood the system. I understood what was happening. None of that prepared me for how I felt when the data started changing. On my screen, on every screen in the facility, the sensor icons representing Dominion vessels began to do something they hadn't done before. They began to go dark. One at a time at first, then in clusters, then in cascades as the grid systems optimized their engagement sequences in real time and began targeting the command and control architecture of the fleet, the ships that were coordinating the others, the vessels whose destruction would cascade into temporary blindness across the entire formation. I felt sick, which surprised me. I'd expected to feel relieved or triumphant or scared, but what I felt in those first minutes was sick. These were living creatures. Whatever they were, whatever they intended, there were living minds aboard those vessels, and they were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands, and it was happening with the cold mechanical efficiency of a system that had no feelings about it at all. I didn't say that out loud. This isn't something I shared with many people. It doesn't fit the narrative that emerged from that night, the heroic narrative, the triumphant narrative, which is also true and also earned. But the sickness was real, and I think it's important to say so. They were not passive. I want to be clear about that, because some accounts of what happened that night, accounts that emerged in the years afterward, in the films and the books and the commemorations, flatten the engagement into something that sounds almost easy, like the grid activated and the fleet just fell apart. That's not what happened. The Vreth Dominion fleet, when it understood it was under attack, responded with genuinely terrifying capability. Their weapons systems were unlike anything we'd modeled. The energy discharge from a single carrier throne, measured from our orbital observation platforms, was sufficient to sterilize a continent. They had point defense systems that could intercept kinetic impactors at velocities we hadn't projected. Their communications, once they understood something was wrong, shifted to a redundant frequency architecture that made jamming extremely difficult. And they adapted, faster than anyone on our side had expected. The fleet broke formation within minutes of the first kinetic strikes, a decision that actually helped them, distributing the targets across a wider volume of space and complicating the grid's targeting cascades. Several grid stations in the outer layer were targeted and destroyed. Not many, but some. The loss readouts scrolling across our screens were a reminder that this wasn't a one-sided event. One of the carrier thrones got through. Not to Earth, not even close to Earth, but it pushed through the outer and middle grid layers and reached intersystem space, and the weapons discharge it released toward Earth was measured in units that I won't try to convert into something relatable because the number doesn't communicate what it means. What I'll say instead is this. The discharge hit the uppermost layer of our atmosphere over the mid-Pacific, and the energy release lit up the sky from Hawaii to the Philippines bright as noon. At 3:30 in the morning, I saw the light reports coming in from our observation stations. Pacific Fleet watching parties who'd been told to evacuate but hadn't, some sailors just couldn't make themselves leave their posts, reported that they saw it, that it was like someone turned on a second sun, that the light cast shadows at sea in the middle of the night. Then the grid's inner layer focused on that carrier throne, and it didn't fire again. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes from the first kinetic strike to the cessation of weapons fire. I was at my station for all of it. I don't remember eating or drinking. I remember the numbers changing. I remember the cluster events when multiple vessels went dark at once. I remember one sequence, a 17-second window around 5 a.m., when the sensor network registered 41 simultaneous termination events in the Dominion fleet, and the room went completely, utterly silent. Nobody cheered, Not once during the entire 4 hours did anyone in that room cheer. I've heard that other facilities were different, that some of the military operations centers had moments of shouting, of relief releasing itself in noise. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's the right response. In our room, it was silence. The kind of silence that means everyone is aware of the weight of what they're watching and isn't sure yet how to carry it. By 7:31 a.m., the sensors showed no active Dominion vessels. The fleet of 412 ships, the first fleet sent by the Vreth Dominion to acquire Earth, was gone. The debris field it left behind would eventually become the subject of intense scientific study, yielding years of research into Dominion technology, materials, and biological remains that reoriented humanity's understanding of what was out there. But in that moment, at 7:31 a.m., all I knew was that the screen in front of me had gone very quiet. The grid's outer layer stations had taken some losses. 14 stations confirmed destroyed, 31 more damaged. No permanent installations on the moon or Earth had been struck. And Earth itself, the planet, the cities, the people, the man in the Tunis market and the woman on the Osaka platform and the kids in Nairobi, Earth was untouched. Preeta's voice came from behind me. "Yusuf," she said. I turned. Her face was doing something complicated, too many things at once to read clearly. She held out her hand. I took it. Outside the viewport on level 3, the North Atlantic was doing what it always does. Long gray swells, a pale morning sky, a horizon curved like the spine of something immense and patient. The planet breathed. The Dominion fleet left behind approximately 4.7 million pieces of trackable debris. That figure comes from the 6-month survey conducted by the Joint Orbital Retrieval Initiative, JORI, which was the first genuinely global space program in history, born directly out of the engagement. Every nation with any kind of launch capability contributed. Small countries sent single vehicles. Large ones sent armadas of recovery ships. The moon base, which had been a joint scientific facility before all this started, was converted into a processing and analysis hub, with pressure modules going up faster than any lunar construction project previously attempted. I joined JORI's analysis division 8 weeks after the engagement, partly because the work was extraordinary, partly because staying on the Iceland platform felt, by then, like watching reruns. The real science was happening up there, in orbit, in the low-gravity labs of the moon base where Dominion hull fragments were being cut open and examined with the kind of careful, shaking-handed reverence that an archaeologist applies to something irreplaceable. Because it was irreplaceable, every piece of that fleet was a window into a civilization that was not ours. A civilization that was technologically ahead of us by centuries in some areas. Their materials science, for example, was staggering. Hull alloys that our best spectrographic analysis couldn't fully characterize, and strangely in other areas, comparable to us or even less advanced. Their computational systems, once we worked out the architecture, were powerful but not quantum. They used something like a very sophisticated optical processing framework. Brilliant engineering, but not beyond what we could understand. Dr. Amara Diallo, the Senegalese materials engineer who led the hull analysis team, once said something at a briefing that stuck with me. She held up a fragment of Dominion hull plating, a piece maybe 30 centimeters across, dull silver gray in color, lighter than it should have been for its apparent density, and she said, "This is not the product of something superhuman. This is the product of very intelligent creatures who had more time than us. That's all. More time and fewer interruptions." Fewer interruptions. She meant fewer existential crises, fewer world wars, fewer near extinctions. A civilization that had developed in relative stability for thousands of years, versus one that had nearly wiped itself out 6 times in recorded history alone. "We should not be proud that we survived the Dominion fleet," she said. "We should be honest about what it means that we barely did." Barely, that word landed hard in the room. Not everyone agreed with her framing. There were people with legitimate perspectives, who felt that the grid's performance was less barely and more convincingly. The fleet had been engaged with something like 78% efficiency on first engagement, which by any military metric was extraordinary. But Amara wasn't talking about military metrics. She was talking about the carrier throne that got through. She was talking about the Pacific Light event. She was talking about what happens if the Dominion had sent 2 fleets instead of 1, or 3. She was right to ask those questions. 6 months and 11 days after the engagement, the second signal arrived. Different frequency, different modulation architecture, different mathematical signature. Different sender. This one we deciphered faster, partly because Leonard's xenolinguistics team had grown enormously and partly because this signal, unlike the Dominion's opener, appeared to be specifically designed to be understood. The structure was almost pedagogical. It walked through a logical framework, step by step, as if whoever sent it anticipated that the receiver might be unfamiliar with the communication format and wanted to help. Which was interesting, because it meant whoever sent it had done some research. Or had been watching. The translation took 11 days of intensive work and yielded something that was clear enough to be more unsettling than the Dominion's terse acquisition demand. This one said, approximately, "We have observed the engagement. We have assessed the outcome. We are the Karath Communion and we are sending an envoy. We wish to understand what happened here. We have not encountered a defended world in 400 years. We are curious." 400 years. In 400 years, the Karath Communion had not encountered a world that fought back. Which meant that in 400 years, every world they'd encountered, and by the scale of an interstellar civilization's reach, that was a lot of worlds, had either surrendered or been overwhelmed. Except Earth. Earth was the first defended world in 400 Karath Communion years. I read that translation sitting in the Moon Base Analysis module at 200 base time, with the Earth hanging outside my viewport, blue and white and ordinary-looking and still somehow there. And I thought, we are an anomaly. And then, because my brain goes where it goes, anomalies attract attention. The envoy arrived 4 months later. Not a fleet, a single vessel. Small by interstellar standards, our sensors pegged it at roughly 2 kilometers in length, which sounds enormous, but after the carrier thrones felt almost intimate. It came in slowly and with what appeared to be deliberate visibility, broadcasting its approach on multiple frequencies, doing nothing to conceal its trajectory or make itself difficult to track. Every maneuver it made said, "I am not hiding. I am not a threat. I am showing you exactly what I am." That was new. The diplomatic crisis that accompanied its arrival was enormous. Every government had opinions about what this meant, about how to respond, about who should speak for Earth. The arguments were spectacular in their scope and their pettiness simultaneously. Representatives invoked territorial claims on space. People argued about symbolic importance, about language representation, about cultural primacy. Eventually, because humans always find a way to eventually, even if the path there is ugly, a delegation was assembled. 17 people from 15 nations, chosen through a process that would have been farcical if the stakes hadn't been so high. Leonard was in it. Colonel Al-Rashidi was in it. Director Enkemelu was in it. Dr. Diallo, despite her sometimes uncomfortable honesty, was strongly lobbied for and included. I was not in it. I watched from the analysis module with a group of colleagues and a truly irresponsible amount of coffee. The contact protocols were established over 3 weeks of signal exchange before the physical meeting. The Karath Communion was patient with this, notably, deeply patient, in a way that felt almost gentle. Their communication team matched their cadence and vocabulary to what our translators indicated we could handle. They simplified. Not condescendingly, there's a difference between condescending simplification and collaborative simplification, and this felt like the latter. When the physical meeting happened, it took place aboard a neutral vessel, a jointly modified ISS extension module that had been modified for the purpose and parked at a point equidistant between Earth and the Communion ship. I won't go into every detail of what was said in that meeting. A lot of it is still classified, and a lot of the rest of it was relayed to the public over subsequent months in carefully managed releases. But there are things I know from people who were there, from records I had access to through my work, and from what eventually became public. The Karath envoys were, the word people keep using is unexpected. Not monstrous, not horrifying, unexpected. Tall, bipedal, but not humanoid. Their physiological structure is genuinely different from ours in ways I don't have the biology background to describe with any precision. They breathed an atmosphere that required modification of the meeting space. They communicated partly through the translation system, and partly through an audio bandwidth that Leonard described as like music that is also logic. They were curious. That was the overwhelming impression that every member of the delegation reported independently without having coordinated their descriptions. Curiosity. The communion envoys looked at the humans in that room the way, and I'm borrowing this image from Colonel al-Rashidi's account, the way a scientist looks at a result that doesn't match the hypothesis. Not with hostility, not with fear, with the pure, urgent, almost hungry need to understand. They wanted to know about the grid, obviously. They'd been studying the engagement from a distance and had a fairly complete picture of what had happened, but they wanted the human perspective on it. They wanted to know how long it had taken to build. They wanted to know how the coordination had worked, how so many separate nations had contributed to one system without any of them fully knowing the shape of what they were building. Director Enkemelu, according to his own later account, answered that one directly. He said, "We had people who understood that some things matter more than who gets credit for them." The envoy, the lead communion speaker, was silent for a moment. Then it said something that translated approximately as, "We will need to understand this concept more fully. It appears to be important." There was a question that the communion asked that became, in the months and years afterward, probably the most discussed single sentence to emerge from that meeting. They asked, "Why did no other world do what you did?" Not "Why did you succeed?" Not "How did you build the grid?" Those were tactical questions. This was something else. Why did no other world do what you did? Why, in 400 years of encountering civilizations, had none of them built something like this? Or if they had, why had it not been enough? What was it about Earth, specifically, uniquely, about this particular small blue planet, that had produced an outcome not seen in 4 centuries of communion observations? The delegation didn't have a clean answer in that room. How could they? It's not the kind of question you answer quickly. But over the months that followed, as the exchange of information between humanity and the communion began, cautiously, carefully, with a lot of verification and caution on both sides, some frameworks started emerging. Dr. Diallo's interrupted development theory got a lot of attention. The idea that Earth's turbulent history, the wars, the near extinctions, the constant crises, had produced a species that was, paradoxically, extraordinarily good at responding to existential threat, because it had never had the luxury of forgetting that existential threats were real. Civilizations that developed in stability might achieve more faster, but they might also lose the muscle memory of survival. Leonard had a different angle. He thought it had to do with conflict diversity. Earth had hundreds of cultures, dozens of major languages, competing philosophical traditions, competing scientific schools. All of this friction, this constant argument with itself, had produced a breadth of problem-solving approaches that a more homogeneous civilization might lack. When the grid was being built, it drew on 53 years of contributions from people who thought differently, who solved problems differently, whose varied histories produced varied solutions. The system that resulted was richer and more adaptable than any single tradition could have built alone. Both theories have merits. Neither is the whole answer. I don't think we've found the whole answer yet. The third signal came from a direction no one was looking. 14 months after the Karath Communion first contact. We'd been deep in ongoing dialogue, exchanging information in both directions, establishing a fragile but real relationship, beginning to understand the broader shape of the galaxy's political landscape as the Communion understood it, when the new signal broke through from a completely different vector. The processing labs had gotten much better at reading unknown signals since the Dominion opener. The xenolinguistics team, now 3 times its original size and operating out of 3 separate facilities across 2 planets and a moon base, chewed through the new signal in 18 hours. This one didn't come from a galactic empire. It didn't come from a communion-class organization. The sender, as best we could determine, was a much smaller civilization, a single-system culture, not interstellar by nature, that had apparently been aware of Earth for some time without making contact. The signal was almost apologetic in its structure, hesitant. It had the quality, and I know this is projecting, of something sent after a very long internal debate. The translation when it came. We have watched the Dominion come for you. We have watched you survive. We watched the Communion send its envoy. We are the Sevi. We have 14 worlds and no weapons large enough to matter against the powers that move between stars. We have been afraid for a long time. We are asking whether you would be willing to speak with us. We would like to understand how a world decides to fight back. We have been afraid for a long time. I read that line about 16 times. A civilization of 14 worlds, not small by any reasonable measure, afraid. Watching the great powers of the galaxy eat civilizations one by one, and doing the math, and knowing that eventually the calculation would include them. Watching Earth, this tiny anomaly, this one world that somehow said no and made it stick. Asking how we did it. Leonard, when he read the translation, sat very quietly for a long time. Then he said, "It's not just us they're asking. They're asking for themselves, but they're also asking on behalf of every world that never figured this out. Every world that's gone or is going. This signal is a prayer and a protest at the same time." I think he was right. The Vreth Dominion was not finished. We'd known this was possible. The Communion had warned us diplomatically but clearly that the Dominion did not accept military defeats as permanent conclusions. They accepted them as problems to be solved with additional resources. 400 ships had been insufficient. The calculation they would reach was simple: send more. The Second Fleet's approach was detected 8 months after the Sevi signal. This time there was no preliminary signal, no acquisition notice, no paperwork. They came in fast and dark, with their energy signatures as low as they could manage. An ambush, as close as physics allows across interstellar distances. It was a much larger fleet. 930 vessels, including 22 carrier thrones. I won't describe the second engagement the way I described the first, partly because I wasn't watching it directly, I was on Earth by then, and partly because the sensor record is public now and people can review it themselves. What I will say is that it was harder. The grid had been repaired and upgraded in the intervening period. Every lesson from the first engagement applied, every vulnerability addressed. But 900 ships is not the same problem as 400 ships, and the Dominion had clearly done their analysis of what happened the first time. The second engagement lasted 9 hours and 4 minutes. The Dominion lost the Second Fleet. But the grid lost more this time, and 3 kinetic strikes from Dominion weapons reached Earth's atmosphere. The Pacific Light event was repeated twice, and once, a weapon's discharge made it through the atmospheric layers and hit ocean's surface. Not land, ocean, near the Azores. The resulting wave event caused evacuation of the island chain and coastal Portugal and was measured in terms that I could translate, but that would be disputed by some of the technical people, so I'll just say, it was significant. Nobody died from the wave. 11 people were injured in the evacuation. But it was proof that the Second Fleet was different. The Dominion had learned, and we had to ask ourselves what comes after the Second Fleet. Chapter 13, The Choice. The debate that followed the second engagement was the hardest conversation humanity had ever tried to have. Not the most urgent. The first engagement was more urgent. We hadn't had time to debate, we just had to survive. But this was harder because now we had time, and because the question on the table was one that didn't have an obviously correct answer. The question was, do we go out there? Not an invasion, not retaliation exactly. But the Dominion was out there, and they were going to keep coming, and the grid was Earth's defense, not the solar systems, not the galaxies. And if the Dominion sent a third fleet larger than the second, which was larger than the first, the calculation eventually stopped working in our favor. Passive defense had a ceiling. Everyone who understood the numbers knew this. At some scale, any attacking force overwhelms any fixed defensive network. The grid was extraordinary, but it was finite. The Dominion, by all available evidence, was not. The Communion offered a perspective that was useful, if uncomfortable. They had faced the Dominion's predecessor culture, not the Dominion as it existed now, but an earlier version, centuries ago, and the way they'd resolved the situation was not through defense. They'd resolved it through what they called the establishment of cost, making the Dominion understand, at a level deeper than military calculation, that the acquisition of the Communion would cost more than the acquisition was worth. Not through defeating a fleet, but through making the entire proposition economically unreasonable. Humans, when they heard this, latched onto it with a ferocity that probably made the Communion envoys nervous. Because humans are very good at 2 things, as Preeta said: surviving, and building things to help them survive. But there is a third thing which she didn't mention and which I've come to believe is equally fundamental. Humans are extraordinarily good at making things expensive for those who threaten them. The combined human response, which took 14 months to design, because these things take time when you're doing them right, was not another fleet. It was something the Communion had never seen anyone attempt. It used the grid not as a purely defensive system, but as a platform from which something could reach out. I don't have clearance for everything that was decided in those 14 months. What I know is the result. The Dominion sent a third fleet. Larger than the second, nearly 2,000 vessels. The third fleet did not reach the heliopause. I'm going to tell you something that isn't in the official records. Not because it's classified, I don't think it is. I think it just never made it into the records because nobody was writing down the small moments during those years, only the large ones. But it matters to me. About 6 weeks after the Third Fleet's destruction, I was back at the Iceland platform. The array had been reoriented to track the Dominion's known home systems, which the Communion had helped us locate, and we were running passive observation of their activity levels, looking for signs of fleet mobilization, looking for the signal traffic that preceded large movements. It was quiet, not the quiet of concealment, not the quiet of something gathering itself for another attempt, just quiet. And the analysts who'd been watching Dominion signal traffic for 3 years were saying, cautiously, carefully, that the signature they were seeing was consistent with something they'd never expected to see. Uncertainty, internal uncertainty. The Dominion signal traffic had the characteristics, rough as our translation framework remained, of a civilization having a debate with itself. Facing the problem that a civilization faces when its fundamental assumption gets proven wrong. Their fundamental assumption had been, there are no defended worlds. There are only worlds that haven't been taken yet. Earth had broken that assumption, not once, 3 times. And now, apparently, the Dominion was sitting with the pieces of that assumption and trying to figure out what they did next. I sat at my station on a quiet Thursday evening, same station, same cold coffee, same stack of reports, and I thought about that. About a civilization so vast and powerful that it casually sent fleets of hundreds of warships as a routine acquisition tool, now sitting with a broken assumption and trying to rebuild their model of the universe around a world that hadn't behaved like it was supposed to. There's something almost poignant about it, almost. I didn't feel too sorry for them. 3 fleets, 2 light events over the Pacific, the wave near the Azores, the grid stations they'd destroyed, the lives lost in the evacuations. Whatever uncertainty they felt, they'd earned it. But I noticed the feeling anyway. That's the thing about being human. You notice feelings even when you're not sure they're appropriate. Chapter 15, a letter that wasn't sent. 3 months after the Dominion went quiet, I did something that isn't in any official record because it wasn't an official action. I wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, not intended to be sent anywhere, just a letter, a way of processing everything I'd been holding for the previous 3 years. I want to read some of it to you, because I think it says something that the official records don't capture, and I think it should be captured somewhere. There are things I keep coming back to. The sandwich on my desk the night of the first signal, cold coffee, a stack of calibration reports. The printing of Chen Wei's image. The way Preeta said now, Yusuf like she always says things, like she's already 3 steps ahead and just needs you to keep up. Colonel Al-Rashidi telling me about 53 years of 1 brick at a time. Leonard Osai saying this message is procedural. It's a form. Like the whole weight of what that meant landed in just those 2 sentences. The North Atlantic on the morning after the first engagement. Gray swells, pale sky, the planet breathing. I keep thinking about scale, about how large the Dominion fleet was and how small we are, and how none of that arithmetic seemed to work out the way it should have. And I keep coming back to something that isn't a number. It's a choice. At some point, many points over many decades, people chose to place 1 brick without asking for credit. To contribute 1 component to a system they'd never see the whole of. To keep a secret not for their own advantage, but because keeping it served everyone. To build something together in the dark without knowing for certain that it would work, without knowing for certain that it would ever be needed, because the alternative was to be unprepared if it was. I don't think the Dominion models for that. I don't think their calculation for insufficient world includes the possibility that the world is running a 53-year game that nobody announced. The Sevi asked how a world decides to fight back. I've been thinking about that question since the signal arrived, and I still don't have a clean answer. But I think the real answer is that the decision to fight back isn't made once. It's made in every ordinary moment when someone who could take a shortcut doesn't. When someone who could cut a corner doesn't. When someone says, I'll place this brick, and it doesn't have to have my name on it, and I'll trust that someone else is placing their brick too. The Dominion looks for worlds that can't resist. We made ourselves into something they couldn't model, not by being invulnerable, by being what? Stubborn? Cooperative? Both, maybe, at the same time in the same system, which sounds contradictory and apparently isn't. I don't know what the galaxy looks like from the outside. I don't know what we look like to the civilizations that are watching. I don't know if the Dominion tries again, or what the Communion will eventually ask for, or whether the Sevi and whatever worlds they might represent will find their way to something like safety. But I know what the North Atlantic looks like in the morning after an impossible night, and I know it keeps moving. I'm going to finish this record the way I started it, with Prita. She retired from Nasal 7 about a year after the third engagement. Or I should say she transferred. She went to the New Pan Solar Defense Initiative as a senior technical advisor, which sounds like retirement but is actually more work with a different title, which is very Prita. On her last day at the Iceland platform, she came by my station, which was the same station it had always been, by this point famous in a small institutional way for being where the first signal was processed. There's a little plaque now. I find it embarrassing. Prita finds it hilarious. She handed me a cup of tea, proper tea. She always knew where to find proper tea on that platform. What happens now? I asked her. She considered this. The question was too large to answer quickly, and she knew it, so she sat with it for a moment the way she always sits with things. The same thing that always happened, she said finally. Someone places the next brick. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. She paused. The galaxy is full of civilizations that look like us and think like us probably, each one in its own version of our position. Each one looking up and wondering if they're alone and wondering if they're safe and wondering if what they're building is enough. And some of them will be fine, some of them won't, and we won't know which is which until it matters. She looked at me with an expression that had settled into something steady and clear. But we're one of the ones that was fine, and we get to do something with that. What? She smiled, one of those rare, full smiles that she doesn't hand out casually. Figure it out, she said. You're good at that. She picked up her tea, looked out the viewport at the North Atlantic, let out a breath. Yusuf, she said. Yeah. Run the filter before you dismiss. And then she left. I still work nights sometimes, old habit. There's something about the deep watch hours that suits the work, fewer interruptions, quieter channels, a kind of clarity that doesn't happen in the daylight rush. The signal environment is different now than it was 3 years ago. The array picks up far more than it used to, partly because of upgrades, partly because of the new relay stations positioned in collaboration with the Communion at distances that would have been unthinkable before first contact. The universe, it turns out, is dense with signal if you know how to listen. Some of it is recognizable now. Dominion traffic, quieter than it used to be, the pattern of a civilization processing something it doesn't know how to process. Communion channels, complex and layered, carrying the business of a vast interstellar relationship that we are now, tentatively, a small part of. Sevi transmissions, they've been talking with us directly for 8 months now, small and careful exchanges, a civilization finding its voice. And other signals we're still working on, sources we haven't characterized, directions we haven't fully mapped. The universe is awake, and it knows we're here. Some of what's out there will be a problem, some of it will be something else. We don't know yet, and not knowing is the condition we live in, the same condition we've always lived in, the same one that put a man in a market in Tunis, and a woman on a platform in Osaka and kids in a classroom in Nairobi, all going about their days, while 400 warships crossed the outer solar system. They're still going about their days. That man in Tunis, I've thought about him so many times I've given him a name in my imagination, though I'll never know if it's right. The woman in Osaka, the kids in Nairobi who are a few years older now. They're still here. The planet is still here. And the signals keep coming in, and we keep running the filters, and somewhere in the deep field, someone is placing the next brick. I think that's enough for the record. I think that's everything I know how to say.